Hey, this is Kenneth, and today I'm going to try and show you guys live how to upgrade the RAM in your Wi-Fi router. So what we have here is, this is just a standard Linksys WRT54G Rev2 router. This is one still in its case. So all I've done is unscrewed the antennas, popped the case open, and taken the motherboard off. So looking at the motherboard itself, it's real easy to see. This is the ROM chip right here, so this is the flash. As you can see, it's got a version number on it. This is the main processor right here. This is the radio front end, this is all the analog stuff for the Wi-Fi. And then over here is your two RAM chips. So right now what it has on it is 2 times 64 megabits, which is 16 megabytes of DDR synchronous RAM. And so what I've done is going to arrow.com, I ordered two 256 megabit DDR RAM chips. And so what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and actually desolder these two RAM chips and replace them with the new ones, and then adjust the ROM to recognize all 64 megabytes of RAM. This lets my router have better abilities as far as being able to look at network traffic, analyze stuff, log stuff, run my own custom scripts. So this is actually a pretty cool little project. Just as a little aside before we get started, looking at the part number for the new one I bought an IS42760D synchronous DDR RAM chip, which comes in a TSOP54-2 package, which means there's 54 incredibly tiny pins on each of these packages. A real easy way, if you're looking at just sticks of RAM to figure out how big they are, is in the part number it says 1616, which means that it's 16 million times 16 bits of RAM. Is depending on how the bus is laid out on the motherboard, your processor will actually handle either 16 or 8 bits at a time. So this is saying that this RAM chip has 16 million 16-bit words, which works out to be 256 million bits, which times 2 RAM chips and divided by 8 bits per byte gives us 64 megabytes of RAM. So to desolder this, I have a standard Heiko 936 soldering station with the OEM chisel tip on it. I've got a small vial of Chip Quick flux, some of the Chip Quick surface mount rework solder. So this is a little analogous to Woods alloy. If you've ever heard of that, this is a in addition to lead and tin, this has a little bit of indium and bismuth, I believe, in it, which means that it's going to melt at a much lower temperature and make it much easier for us to lift the chip off. As far as tools, in addition to the soldering iron, I just have a pair of ESD tweezers that I bought from Adafruit, and we're going to try and see if I can find this useful. This is the first time I've tried this. This is a vacuum pen. So it's got a little plunger, a little button on the side, and then it's used to pick up integrated circuits. So we're going to see if that's useful. I pulled it out of the trash, so we may not. So the process is going to be fairly simple. We're going to apply flux to it, and then we're going to take this indium solder and we're going to melt it in to try and supplement the likely lead-free solder that's already there. That means at that point it's going to be much easier to melt all of it at once with a single iron, and then we should be able to come with the tweezers and just pick the whole thing up, and it should just come off. I very well may make an absolute fool of myself, so just bear with me. So let's go. Let's get started. So first we're going to apply this flux along the whole thing. We're going to do one chip at a time, and if the first one dies, obviously we don't even need to bother trying to get the second one off. And then once we completely desolder it, we'll then clean up the pads and we'll solder the new ones on. So we'll take some of this indium solder, and so I'm just going to lay it down and then start working it in to the pads like this. Yeah, boy. The reason that we put flux on here is that this IC has been sitting here soldered in for so many years that the surface of the solder is fairly badly corroded, and so by itself the solder isn't going to tend to want to mix with the new Chip Quick solder that we're applying. So the flux is going to clean up that oxide layer and let us really come in and let it all intermingle, because really the key is we need to melt the solder underneath the pads, and then at that point it'll be able to just lift off. So you can see as I'm just sitting here stroking both sides, the solder stays liquid for absolutely surreally long time. So we're going to probably put a little bit more. You also notice that I'm having it in this kind of thick bead, which makes it a little bit easier, because the thicker the bead is, the more thermal mass the solder has, and just the longer it's going to stay liquid, which is what we need. So it's just ever so light pressure. I mean, it is like, I'm not even, pressure is kind of the wrong word. It's kind of like I'm just holding the tweezers there, because if you really try and put any pull on it at all, you're going to destroy these pads, because these pads are incredibly tiny, and on these multi-layer consumer boards like this, the traces are not well held down, and so when you get the leverage across a 54 pin package like this, it's really easy to just tear these traces apart. And then, you know, on a 6 or an 8 or a 10 layer board, you then just destroyed, absolutely destroyed the device, because you don't, so you can see it didn't quite all come off at once, so we're going to sit here and try and, oh, look at that. So there's the chip off. So we're just going to lay it over here, and then we're going to grab some solder braid, and you just come in and we'll come back with like a Q-tip later. I'm just trying to sponge it up as much as I can, really look at it, and you can see all these pads are still nicely sitting there. So that went really, really well. So now we'll just repeat the process on this one. So again, apply flux. And then as much of this indium as we can kind of recover and shuffle over from one to the other, we will. Because even just this 4 foot spool of the chip quick was rather expensive. It was about, for the flux and the 4 feet of solder, it was about $13. You can obviously buy just the spools of solder in larger quantities, but when you're just to get the starter kit at first with all the instructions and everything, I figured I'd pay the premium and actually see if it was useful, which it is. So I highly recommend that if you are ever looking at a surface mount chip that you no longer want on a circuit board, Chip Quick is by far the best answer. I was looking at possibly buying like a hot air rework station or something, but this stuff has just absolutely removed the need for that. Removing these chips is now completely trivial. So again, we're just nice and evenly applying heat to both sides. If you had 2 soldering irons, you could even have a buddy come in and the two of you just sit there and gang up on it a little bit. And so we really just want to make sure that this whole thing melts nice and evenly, and so that when it comes loose, the whole thing will just wave goodbye to the circuit board. Just float away. This one just doesn't seem to be cooperating as well. But I'm not going to do any editing because I kind of want to give you guys kind of a sense of the velocity that this goes at. You really do just need to give it patience and time. Some things in life you just Can't rush. You know, managers, surface mount chips. It's a special breed. Oh, look at that. And there it goes. Whole thing just came off. So, now we're going to get Q-tips. We're doing this live, people. And then we're just going to come in. The Q-tips work real well because this solder is so incredibly liquid that you can just wipe it off. This is the first time I've done anything major, because before this I've only used this stuff on real big SO packages and stuff. So this is kind of a learning experience on both sides here. Another thing is, if you're really getting serious into electronics, stop skimping on your solder braid. As I keep buying this cheap, you know, one hung low brand Chinese surplus solder braid, and it's not good solder braid. It just isn't. I'm really kind of getting fed up with, you know, trying to save $1 or so and wasting an incredible amount of time in circuit boards and projects because I just don't have nice enough equipment. So really, I mean, sometimes you just have to, I mean, obviously you can get away with the cheap stuff sometimes, and, you know, as to what you can get away with on the cheap stuff versus what you can't get away with on the cheap stuff, that's kind of a learning experience. So I encourage you that, you know, when you're working with this stuff, at least once, just buy the nice stuff, you know. Break down, spend the $100 on a really nice, well, I wouldn't say really nice, but on a serious solder station. I'm never going to go back. The $100 I spent on my Heiko soldering station was quite possibly the best $100 I've spent in this hobby, because it has just absolutely changed how I interact with soldering projects, which I couldn't appreciate. I was like sitting there like, what in the world makes a $100 soldering iron so much better than the $25 Weller that you can go pick up at Fry's or Halted or whatever you guys have as far as suppliers. Radio Shack, I guess, has a kit that's of about the same magnitude. So the solder braid I've picked up most of this indium. I really don't like using solder braid on surface mount stuff like this because it has a real tendency to, if you're not careful, the solder braid will seize, and the solder braid will actually solder itself to the you know, pads, those things, and then you're really not in any kind of better, you're in an almost worse situation than you were to begin with, because now you have this giant piece of copper soldered to all these tiny pads that you're trying to get off without destroying the pads, which is, you know, kind of the opposite of where you want to go. So you want to be really careful that you have a big enough soldering iron that it can handle the size solder braid that you're using. And something that's kind of fun if you look at this. DDR is a very flexible RAM bus, and so you'll notice that there's two landing patterns for these DDR SRAM chips. You'll notice there's actually a second higher density chip, and so if instead of running these two 8-bit chips in parallel, you could run one 16-bit RAM chip there, which is another good skill when you're designing PCBs, is that you start designing in these extra provisions, so if you want to come back later and upgrade it or use a different actual device, that's possible. So I think these pads are about as well cleaned up as we're going to get them, and so I think we're ready to come in now and apply the new RAM chips. So what we're going to do is we're going to come in again and we're going to dab down some nice gel flux. I typically get, boy, I couldn't tell you what my normal brand is, but I'll link it in the blog post. I bought a really nice, like 5cc or 10cc syringe of gel flux, and that again is another thing that has just made it really nice. Yay! So we're gonna do these one at a time. So there's our first TSOP 54, and now we're just gonna grab some standard 60-40 tin lead solder. This is 32 thousandths of an inch thickness, which is a little big, but I got 1.5 pounds of it for free because, you know, I live around the South Bay and people just kind of throw this stuff away. So you just watch Craigslist and someone's like, yeah, I was an amateur radio operator and I'm moving out of town. So he gave me his whole junk box and all his solder and all his spare components and stuff. So it's a networking issue more than anything else. So what we got is, make sure that on the chip it's got a little dot, and on the silk screen on the motherboard you can see there's this little notch on one side. So we've got it oriented correctly, and then I've got it kind of right where I want it. I'm going to come in, I've got a little bit of solder on the iron. We're just going to tack one corner like that. Yeah, so now that corner's down. We're just going to look at it again. And it's still in the right place, because as soon as you tack this second far corner, I'm going to do the number 1 pin, and then I'm going to come over here and do the number 27 pin. Once you tack that second corner, your options as far as moving the chip around really kind of disappear. So we're going to come in and apply some heat, and the solder is just going to flow off the iron. So now this chip is really in there. Obviously most of the contacts aren't made yet, but it's really well put down. So now we'll just come in and touch each one, and between the amount of solder on the pads already and then a little bit of solder that we have, I mean, there is only like the head of a needle as far as amount of solder on this already. Come in. So really we're just melting the solder that's already there and just making sure that we have really nice, good contacts on each pin. Having the chisel point is a real advantage here, because if your reflexes, you're going to want to get a real sharp conical soldering iron tip, but those really aren't so nice for surface mount, because you really want to be applying heat to both the pad and the pin, and about the only good way to get at both of them at once is with this kind of flat screwdriver tip. And so I'm putting it down on the board and then sliding the soldering iron in there. So we're just going to untape the board, clean the tip, put a little bit more solder on there, and then start working our way down the other side. And obviously I've got a couple of bridges here. If you really put too much solder in there, you might have to come in with some solder braid and suck it back out. But really, as long as you have a soldering iron with a good tip that you've been taking care of, you can just take a damp sponge, wipe it off. So now there's almost no solder on this tip. And just come in and touch it, and it'll pick up a little bit of the solder. You wipe it off. So really we're kind of using the soldering iron itself as the solder braid here, because I mean these things are, I think this is a 0.5 millimeter pitch. So I mean these pins are so incredibly tiny that, you know, there's almost nothing there, which is why this single pound of solder that I got 2 years ago is, you know, still almost all here, because I mean the amount of solder that you use when you're doing this stuff is just incredibly tiny. Alright, so I think, and bridge back on me there. Back. And that really isn't. Yeah, so right there, I think we've just about got it. So that is one of the two chips soldered in using just a standard, if I can find it, using just a standard 10x jeweler's loop. We're going to sit here and look at it and really kind of, look deep into the soles of these solder joints. You can see there's one bead here that's making me a little nervous, so we're going to just hit that with a little heat. And then my number 54 and my number 53 pins are also freaking me out a little bit, so I'm just going to hit that with some heat right there. When you're surface mount soldering, a lot of the key is you're really not doing the same soldering that you do with through hole, as far as I'm going to apply heat and solder here. Yeah, I think that's pretty good. Is when you're surface mount soldering like this, a lot of it comes down to really kind of understanding what the solder wants to do. Is you really have to appreciate that, if you put the flux down, the solder will come, so it's much more understanding what is the natural tendencies of lead, as far as its viscosity and its surface tension, and if you just apply heat in this general area, what's the solder going to want to do? Because when you're dealing with 0.6 or 0.5 millimeter, or like a 30 thou QFN or something, you're not going to be able to say, I want to apply heat and solder here, because each one of these pins is smaller than the iron. But that's not a problem, because really, alright, clean that up. We got a little bit of solder cross-contaminated here from when I was working on the first chip. And really, we want to make sure that there's no bridges to begin with, because TSOP54 is about as hard as it gets while still having leads. Because if you want to solder down a chip any more challenging than this, you're going to really have to switch to the quad flat packs that just don't have any leads at all. Or BGA. BGA is the death of every hobbyist electronics guy, because you can't apply heat, and so you're gonna have to use a reflow oven, or that's where the classic laptop repair comes in. As far as if your graphics card, so like this right here is a BGA. This has actually a couple hundred pins on the bottom of it, and if any of those solder joints break, about the only way to fix this is you take the whole motherboard and you put it in an oven, and you would actually bake it until all the solder reflows again, which is kind of terrifying. But like I've had friends that have successfully resuscitated their laptops by just taking the whole motherboard and putting it in the oven, which is a bolder claim than I have ever done. I've never quite gotten that far before, but again, it's just understanding what the solder wants to do. Alright, so we're going to come in here and just nudging it around. The second one's a little bit harder, because now we're working up against this big 1206 cap on one side, and the actual integrated circuit on the other side. So I think that's pretty well positioned. Yep. I'm just kind of babbling endlessly here, because this really isn't that exciting, which I apologize. Obviously, you guys don't need to tell me how boring this video is. If you're getting bored, obviously, you can click stop. It's YouTube. It's not like this is TV or anything. Boy, this chip just doesn't want to sit. Yeah, so now when I soldered that down, it shifted a little bit, so it's not quite sitting centered on the pad, which is important because a lot of surface mount soldering is very dependent on surface tension, which is why you have all the circuit boards have these green solder masks. This green stuff is very lead is very solder phobic. Because if you can lay down some solder on it and it'll just beat up. And by having that yeah, sorry about that. Camera died. Imagine that I spent 10 more minutes working on cleaning up all the nice little solder joints on the RAM chips, and then spent half an hour dorking with the bootloader to try and get it to talk to it. I actually did manage to get to talk to it at one point. As you can see, ooh, there's the Tomato web browser on it, and there's SSH on it. But once I managed to set it to look for 64 megabytes of RAM, the hardware Mac has committed suicide. So I think this router is dead. Obviously, this is a very treacherous modification to do to a router. I've successfully done it 1 of 4 times now, but I did manage to upgrade one of these to 32 megabytes of RAM, which was really kind of nice. But I think this one's dead. So I've reset it a couple times and managed to talk to the bootloader, but now the Ethernet on it isn't even coming up. So I think this is e-waste. But I hope you enjoyed kind of to see the process of replacing the RAM chips, and if I had been a little bit luckier or a little bit more conservative as far as only going for 32 instead of 64, I very well might have a working router now, but I don't. So this has been Kenneth, showing you how to mod your router. I probably don't suggest you try this yourself, seeing as how even I'm not successful at it.